Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over the board chess player, and in this series we were going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games. But we've already hit 2000 elo, so we're going to push it a little bit higher, and I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. My opponent starts with d4 and we go c6 for various reasons, one of them being to invite my opponent into a Caro Kann, which obviously we want. If you know anything about the channel, if you've seen the channel before, you'll know I love the Caro Kann. You can also obviously see in my username. And my opponent goes for the advanced variation with e5. Now, here you kind of go bishop to f5 or c5. Both of them are completely viable. Both of them are pretty different, depending on how you play them. I personally prefer the move c5, though. And we basically say, okay, you've taken some space with e5. Sure. I'm going to try and undermine your d-pawn, which is defending your e5 pawn. So my opponent goes c3. We're going to go knight to c6. And just apply more pressure. And if you're wondering, can white take on c5? Or could white just take on c5 here? Yeah, white can take. And it's probably the best move. From a perspective of being more challenging. This line, though, this is not a good line. And white is... I think black is actually slightly better now. Because the way that white's played this, we've traded our c-pawns off. And what that essentially does is allows us to get our bishop to g4 because knight f3 has been played. We have this pawn on d4, which can't be protected by another pawn. And it's just eternally weak, basically. Like, it's just incredibly weak. We have pressure on the knight, which is defending the d-pawn. It can't be defended by another pawn. And if the d-pawn falls, then the e-pawn will fall. And you can just see that white looks a little bit passive here. So my opponent plays the move a3. I've got to be honest, that's a bit of a strange move. The first thing that's on my mind is the immediate queen to b6. Basically saying, if you do something like castling, then I'm just going to take, and take. And if queen to b6, bishop to e3, defending d4, we can take on b2, although lines look very complicated after knight b to d2. So I'm not sure I want a part in that, to be honest. So I think I'm just going to go knight g to e7, which we will, of course, check with the computer after the game, see if it thought I should have gone for queen b6 immediately. Personally, though, I really like the maneuver of knight e7, knight e5, sorry, knight f5. This is a very common strategy in the Caro Kann. And a big idea is that, obviously, your knight can't go to f6. If your knight goes to h6, it will be taken. And your bishop probably wants to go to e7 because you don't have any of these squares to go to, right? And fianchettoing doesn't really make sense because you're staring at absolutely nothing because the pawn is well defended. So the bishop wants to go to e7 and we want to castle, right? The knight on f5 is an excellent piece because one, it attacks d4, which is obviously weak. And two, this bishop will likely come to e3 as it has done. So we also have eyes on the bishop, which we could use to our advantage later on. Now my opponent goes bishop to e3 because there's no real other good way to defend. And we have a couple choices. Again, we can go queen to b6. But realistically, if we take, we are self-pinning. Well, probably take with this knight so we can take the bishop. Probably. Although things look a little bit complicated. I don't think I want a part in all of those complications, to be totally honest. I think bishop e7 is probably easier. If queen b6, we obviously also hit the b2 pawn. If a move like knight b to d2... Oh, yeah, well then take and white is fine. And I really don't want to take on b2. So I'm just going to go bishop e7 and castle. And I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not going to win a pawn straight away. That's fine. That's cool. But at some point, I probably will. So let's get ourselves castled. And I would argue that if you look at this position, we have the better structure. My opponent goes h3. Very common idea in the Caro Kann Advance variation, by the way, and in some other Caro Kann lines. if you're pinning a knight or just attacking a knight on f3, normally you only take if one, you're going to win material from it, or two, you are provoked with h3. Because if we take without white provoking it, well, white gets an extra move. Whereas if white provokes us and then we take, we kind of wanted to take anyway. Because we have so many pawns on light squares, we don't mind trading off our light squared bishop. I think bishop to g5 is a move that should be considered here, offering a trade of bishops to weaken the d-pawn. This is an idea that I've only started to really understand recently. Obviously, you know, I'm a good chess player, but there's always more things to learn. I think this is a pretty strong move. We could also play a move like rook a to c8, of course. We could play a move like queen to b6. But I think bishop g5 is actually quite a strong move. Yeah, there's some pretty interesting things here. Like, for example, queen d2. I'm pretty sure we can just go ahead and take on d4. Because if bishop takes, the queen hangs. And if queen takes, then we take the queen. So my opponent goes rook e1 to defend the bishop instead. I believe knight h4 is sometimes an idea to chase this bishop, but here I don't think just yet. Also, did we miss an opportunity to do this? Although I suppose the knight would hang. Should be kept in mind, though. Okay, should we take? After takes, queen g5. If e4, then we can go ahead and take on d4, I think. Still complicated. I think we should take, though. I think we should take. And I mean, this is a very interesting position. Queen g5 looks incredibly natural. Just to apply pressure. Again, queen to d2, I believe, just blunders knight to d4. Because, again, we utilize the pin on the queen. And it's not actually that easy to defend the e3 pawn. I mean, you could play a move like queen e2, of course. That does work. But, I don't know, the queen is a little bit passive, I would argue. I would say we have a nice looking position. Yeah, he does go for it. And e4 can't be played because we will take on d4 with tempo, which is a really nice part of this position. We could consider a move like f6, trying to open up the f-file. And white can't really allow this, so white would probably have to take. To be honest, that looks really strong. I'm going to go for it. I'm not even going to calculate too hard because the way I see it, e4 can't be played, meaning that white can't break in the center. This queen can't come to the queen side because it looks too dangerous to give up the e-pawn, especially because the d-pawn will hang afterwards. By playing f6, I'm forcing white to take me, and I feel like I'm getting a bit of an overload on the king side after moves like knight to h4, threatening after take, moves like knight takes f3 check. And you can't take with a pawn because of the pin, and you can't take with a queen because I'll just take your queen. Obviously, there's lots of other ways this position could go, and you could argue that I'm weakening my e6 pawn, which I am, but having the ability to like double up on the f-file or shift a rook to the h-file to h6 or g6 in like a rook lift idea seems ridiculously strong to me. And this is a great example of how you can play the Caro Kann in quite an aggressive manner. And people don't normally attribute aggression to the Caro Kann. Furthermore, I think a move like knight d4, I think actually almost wins. Wait. Does that win? Because after takes, I'm playing on the fact, well, I'm recycling my idea of knight to h4. The reason why knight h4 doesn't quite work is because the king just moves out of the way, right? And then, like, well, if I take, yeah, I can do this and play a move like queen g3, and that does look strong. But after queen to g2, white survives, right? Obviously, I could set that up with a move like rook a to f8, and that's probably winning. But a move like knight takes d4 looks deadly because, yeah, does this not just win? Obviously, my opponent's trying to defend his e-pawn, but that's a very passive move. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. The channel is blowing up at the moment, and it's absolutely awesome. So thank you all so much for the support. I think knight takes d4 is the move because we fork the queen and the bishop, right? Maybe we should take with this knight. We fork the queen and the bishop. So if the queen moves, then we just take the bishop, and you can't take because of this, and you can't take because of this, right? So that's deadly. If we take, we still have the fork. You have no check on my king because e6 is guarded, unless you want to give up your queen, but I'm guarding it twice anyway. If you play a move like queen to e3, offering me a queen trade, I will take on f3 with check. And I'm just winning material. I'm winning a lot of material. This looks like game over to me. Knight f takes d4. An impossible looking move. But I think this is game ending. This pressure is just too much. And obviously, we could have also swung our other rook onto the f-file. That probably would have been completely winning. But you can see, like, two of white's pieces are essentially out of the game. This rook on e1 is also kind of out of the game. It's not really doing anything in terms of defending the king side. And the tactics just seem to flow in our favor. And yeah, kind of stemming from the idea of opening up the f-file. And the knight on f5, as I mentioned all the way back in the opening, like, I don't know, maybe 15 moves ago, comes in absolutely clutch, teaming up with the knight on c6 to take on d4. And yeah, I of course had to check. Well, this is going to be a great pun. I of course had to check that white had no way to move the queen with an attack on my king, otherwise known as a check, so that he could get the queen out of danger and then move the bishop, getting the queen out of danger with tempo, of course. But nothing works, because even a move like queen to e3 doesn't work. Because let's say I take, then white is fine, right? White is up a piece for 2 pawns, which is good. The problem is that I can take on f3. Not only is my queen defended, so even if it didn't come with a check, take, and I'd be up 2 pawns. But also, after queen e3, knight takes f3, it comes with a check and an attack on the rook. So white doesn't have time. Time is completely against the white position here because my pieces are very well placed and white's pieces are not well placed. There's been loads of chess players who have probably articulated this idea better than me, who have essentially said, you know, if you put your pieces on good squares, better squares than your opponent, and your pieces are more active than your opponent's, most likely tactics are going to flow in your favor. Because if your pieces, like, let's just go back a few moves. Look how passive the white position is. Look how passive. My pieces can see so many different things and are far better placed than the white pieces, right? So, as a result of the positional advantage that we have, because we have outmaneuvered white, tactics are more likely to flow in our favor. And how do I find a tactic like knight f takes d4? Because I think I mentioned this exact thing in my last video when I was finding a tactic. I said, look, well, yeah, I will explain actually. How do you actually come up with this idea? Because you can see the tactic and then be like, okay, yeah, take, fork. Yeah, that's completely winning. Awesome. But how do you actually find that move? Well, the way I find it is I go, well, knight h4, and you can see how this bishop could be very vulnerable. The problem is white has time there. So what if I take away the time by hitting both pieces at once? And also, it doesn't matter if I lose the knight because, hang on, I'm winning 2 pawns. And you still have all the same problems. My opponent goes queen e3, but it doesn't help after knight takes f3 check. And of course, do not take the queen here. That would be a horrific blunder, and you'd be... Actually, you would have knight to c2 there, so you could still fight, but you'd be worse. Also, do not take the rook and hang your queen. That doesn't work. There is no mate because the king has the h2 square. We have no way to deliver a checkmate there, unfortunately. I'm trying to think if there's a better way to win this. Like, can we play a move like queen to g3, for example? Because if take, and what? I just play like knight to d4. I'm obviously completely winning, but I'm just trying to find a potentially quicker win. Taking obviously makes no sense. That much is obvious. Queen g3, I like the look of, because we keep the queens on the board. We threaten mate in 1. We also threaten the rook. If queen g3, the only move seems to be taking on f3, then this makes no sense because of this. So queen g3 take check here. Rook g6, king f2, and queen g2 looks to be checkmate. I think that is unstoppable. Yeah, and if you go queen back to defend, then I'll just gobble up the rook or with the knight and be up way too much material. Of course, you could trade queens and just play an endgame 2 pawns up, and you'd be completely winning. You're more active anyway. This knight sucks. This rook sucks, although it obviously can come to c1. So we'd probably play rook to c8. But this looks way more winning. And, you know, if you have a choice between being up 2 pawns and playing an endgame, or checkmating your opponent, / being up a rook, then I'd probably take the latter. If you wanted to play queen takes just to be more simple, that's fine. But this is completely winning. This is completely winning, and it's a far easier way to win the game than going through all the commotion of an endgame where, you know, white can still fight back. White can still try stuff. These pawns might get weak, and if I lose one of them, and I'm only 1 pawn up, that might not be so winning. Whereas this is just a forced checkmate after my opponent takes the knight. Even here, material is technically equal. So even if there was no checkmate, it wouldn't be the end of the world because you still have equal material and the white king would still be in insane distress. So my opponent resigns because obviously after king to f2, the only legal move other than queen to g5, we have mate in 1. The only way to last longer is to sack the queen and run to e3. But I mean, I don't even need to checkmate my opponent here. I'm up way too much material. There's loads of different things I can do. I can just win a rook as well as the queen. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you learned some really good Caro Kann ideas in that game. But let's get into the analysis, see what the computer has to say, and I'll run you through some of the other lines so you can learn even more. Okay, that is nuts. 99.3% accuracy. If you've seen the previous episode, that's like 2 perfect games in a row. I would argue this one was more impressive, though, because it was longer. But okay. The game starts d4, c6. I play c6 on move 2. 1, to invite my opponent into a Caro Kann. 2, if c4, I'll just go into a Slav. 3, if bishop f4 gets played and my opponent wants to play a London, I have the move queen to b6, which is actually really good for black. But okay, we go into a Caro. My opponent plays the advanced, and we go c5. As I said during the game, yes, white can take on c5, and black won't win the pawn back immediately, but it's a very interesting position nonetheless. Black will most likely win the pawn back at some point, though, either of the pawns. But okay, my opponent goes c3, just defending his pawn chain. We go knight to c6, applying more pressure. Again, you can take... Here, I can just take on e5, though, of course. Again, trying to exploit the fact that these pawns are a little bit vulnerable. And my opponent goes knight to f3, which just isn't that good a move. Better is bishop b5, just pinning the knight. The problem with knight to f3 is, firstly, we take on d4, because the knight can't take, because we'll take on e5. So we force the c pawn to take, meaning that the new d pawn has no possible protection from any other pawns, because there's no c pawn, and there's also, well, the e pawn is too far advanced, right? And then the crucial move, bishop g4. Here, what we're basically doing is we're utilizing our light squared bishop to pin the knight to the queen so that the knight no longer defends the d4 square. That much is obvious. We also prepare the move e6 because now our bishop is outside of the pawn chain. My opponent goes bishop to e2, which is fine, just breaking the pin, and we go e6. I did mention, oh, maybe we can go queen to b6 and apply pressure, and if a move like bishop to e3, maybe we can take. But as you can see by the evaluation, the computer hates this. A lot of the time, trying to take on b2 or win the d-pawn too early isn't actually that good. You need to be tactical about when you go queen to b6, if at all. It's not actually that necessary most of the time. So we just go e6. We have complete equality, if not black is a bit better, by what, move 6? That's really good. That's really good. My opponent goes a3, which is just a very dubious move. Apparently, we can go ahead and take and play queen b6 already. And after bishop to e3, queen b2, knight d2. Oh, okay. The computer wants to snap on d4. Although, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think I want to play this. Because, like, in this position, black is completely lost unless you find queen b5, stopping this. I think I've actually had a similar position to this before in an older video. It wasn't fun. It was not fun. I mean, you don't want to play this. I'm going to be honest with you. You don't want to play this. Just develop. Get your king castled. So knight g to e7. Castles. Knight f5. And the knights are just fantastic. And as we saw later in the game, they were the difference maker. Bishop e3, the only move to defend your pawn properly. You could play knight bd2, because if take, then take, you are defending the d-pawn adequately. You can't take straight away, because after takes, if you take, then take, and if you take with the knight. Or you can take on c6 first, and you're down a piece. So bishop e3, and again, you could go queen to b6, but after knight bd2, if you take, you're in I would say a lot of trouble. You're up a pawn, but again, I would not want to play this with black. And I've been playing the Caro Kann for quite a while, and I used to go for these pawn grabs, and the more I've played it, the more I've realized, just get castles. Like, you have good pressure. You don't need to go pawn grabbing like that. And as we saw in this game, the pressure paid off. Knight c3, just developing, we castle. And here, it's difficult to play for white. Like, what do you do? If you play a move like rook to c1, again, the computer wants f6 immediately. It also likes to move knight a5 to try and do something like take, and knight c4. Black is clearly better, I would say, because not only do we have more pieces in our opponent's territory, but we also have way more pressure than my opponent does. White is simply defending himself. So he goes h3. And you should take, really. You could retreat and meet g4 with knight e3, with attacking the queen, forcing this, bishop g6. You could do this, but it's better to take. Most of the time, taking on f3 when provoked is a good idea. This bishop is not impressive. We go bishop g5. By the way, you could consider moves like knight e5, and after d5 go d4, because you counter fork. It's not all that good, though. I would argue this is slightly better for white, maybe. Then I bishop d2, dc3, bishop c3. I mean, white has the bishop pair. You could argue that our knight is very strong, and maybe bishop c5 is a cool idea, but there's no need to be trading off pieces like that. It's unnecessarily fancy. Here, I was debating between bishop g5 and rook c8. Also, queen b6 is a move. All of these moves are playable, but we go bishop g5. In this position, you might be wondering, is f6 playable? Yeah, it is, and white has to take. And after bishop to f6, you have very good pressure on d4. You kind of force the move knight e2 to defend, and this is a completely pleasant position to play. Also, what's the... Oh, okay, cool. All right, interesting. We go bishop g5, though, which, like I said, is an idea that I've recently been understanding more and more, because you're basically saying, you can't take me, because d4 is so weak, you have to go knight back to e2, and then I have moves like knight to h4, exploiting the fact your bishop is no longer defended. And after like queen d3 defending, rook at ac8, you can't really kick me out. But there's queen d2. That is nuts. The queen is undefended. So if take, then take. And if this, then yeah, okay, that's insane. But I mean, okay, even if you took the bishop, you'd still be clearly better. You own the c-file. You can still infiltrate with the queen. You could also play a move like knight a5 to come to c4 or go rook c2. d4 is just perennially weak. It's always weak. My opponent goes rook to e1. I also mentioned that queen d2 can't be played because, well, I was thinking of taking on d4. Wait, what was I thinking here? I think for some reason I thought I could do this and then go for this, which I can, but it's not actually that good. Better is just to take, and after this, just go queen g5. Basically what happened in the game. So my opponent goes rook e1. Yeah, I was probably a bit off on those tactics. Anyway, my opponent goes rook e1. I take, which is the best move. You don't really want to take with the knight because the knight's better than the bishop. The knight has more maneuverability. And especially once this trade happens, the knight can jump into these weak squares at any point. And we go queen g5. Of course, threatening to win a pawn. White has to defend in some manner. Queen d2, like I said, doesn't work because we take on d4, and you can't take because of this. And I'm threatening this, and I'm threatening this. It's game over. So queen e2. And here, I was considering knight to h4, but I was like, well, it's okay. But bishop g4, it's not actually that impressive. There's the interesting move h5 followed by knight g2, queen h5. But it isn't all that good. I also considered rook a to c8, which is a completely viable move. Just getting on the open file. Maybe preparing knight to a5, knight to c4. Again, white can never play e4 because I will just take on d4. And basically do what we did in the game, except I didn't have to sacrifice a piece for it in this line. But f6 is the move. And how do I find the move f6? Because you shouldn't always play f6 in these structures, but here it's a really strong move. Firstly, you should notice we have a ton of pressure, right? We have a lot of pressure in the center. Secondly, we want to get more pieces in the game. You could, if this pawn disappeared, right, you could see how the rook could be a big problem for white to deal with on the open f-file, right? So, I want to open up the f-file. f6 is also good because white only has one move. You can't let me win a pawn like this. That's game over. White also can't play e4 and counterattack because I have knight takes d4 at all times, right? So white has one single move, which makes calculation very easy. Rook f6, obviously. And in this position, there is actually only one move that saves the game for white. You can try and find it if you want. You can pause the video, try and find it. It's bishop g4, shutting down the g-file and getting the bishop out of the line of fire. Here we have knight g3, hitting the queen. Queen d3. And we can continue with h5. and the computer wants e4, but if the bishop retreats, I mean, knight back to f5, and this is pretty dire. Again, e4, we have knight h4 this time. We're also going to double rooks. It's pretty bad. Another reason why I like the move f6 is because after the trade, e6 can't be exploited properly, because normally this pawn would be back on f2, and if it was, this wouldn't be such a good move because e6 would be weak to the queen and the rook on e2 and e1. Whereas with the pawn on e3, you can't do anything about my e6 pawn being weak. It's also protected once anyway. So my opponent blunders with knight d1. Here we can take with either knight, doesn't really matter. We take with the f knight. And you have to take. I mean, if you move your queen, okay, that's not a good example. I mean, what's a good example though? If you move your queen, I just take, and I'm at least up, what? A piece? Yeah, and a pawn. And you're probably getting mated. So you have to take knight d4. And the reason that I played this move with such confidence is because it's completely forcing. There is nothing you can do in terms of counterattacking or playing like another random strange move in the middle of the sequence. Like you can't throw in a move like h4 here, for example, because your queen always hangs with check. So there's no alternative, which makes it a completely forcing line and therefore easier to calculate. Knight d4, ed4, knight d4. The threat is renewed. The computer just wants to sack the queen. That's how bad the situation is. I also know the queen can't move with a check on my king because it doesn't have access to this diagonal in any way, which again makes this easier to play. We know the queen needs to move. The queen doesn't have that many squares, and it doesn't matter where the queen goes. I will take on f3 with check every single time. So again, makes the calculation very, very easy, and everything comes with check, so counterattacks never work. Queen e3. Of course, we take on f3 with check. The king moves to h1. And here, as I said, we could do this. And after rook e3, we could play a move like knight d2 or knight d4. And we can play this endgame. And we should win up 2 pawns. But, you know, white can try and fight back. Right? So, I was looking for alternatives. Because I'm thinking, okay, 2 of my pieces are under attack right now. If I can move my queen, like let's say even a move like queen g6, and I get my knight out of there, right? Obviously I would take the rook, but let's say I can get my knight back to f5. I would rather play this position, personally, than the endgame with the queens off the board, because the white king is incredibly weak, and I'm sure I can get some kind of attack going. Something like this looks pretty nice. So, I'm like, okay, can I move my queen in a way that white can't take my knight, and then I can save the knight? That was my thought process. I want to keep queens on the board. Then I realized queen g3 is incredibly forcing, because we're hitting so many things at once. And I'm avoiding the queen trade. Then you start to realize, well, I'm actually threatening mate in 1. And the only way to stop it is to give up your queen or to take the knight. If you take with the queen, I win your queen. Okay, that's easy calculation. So what happens if g takes? Obviously, you have to see this from this position. So you're like, okay, queen g3. Well, I'm threatening mate, so you have to take the knight. And the line is completely forcing, which makes this easy calculation. Because you're like, okay, queen h3, king g1. How do I give another check? Well, if I give a check here, the king just goes back. Well, then I have mate, or the queen gives herself up. But if the king goes to f1, that's a little bit trickier. Although, to be fair, you do have rook to f3 in that line. But the point is, again, I could give this check. If this, then this. And if this, then I have this. But more simple is just rook to g6 check. And obviously my opponent resigned because either he gives up the queen or he brings the king to the only square and queen g2 is mate. The entire line is forced. And that doesn't mean it's necessarily easy, but it's far easier than if there's loads of intricate things that could happen. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you a lot of lessons in the Caro Kann and how to play the Caro Kann better, and just chess in general better, like the tactics, the positional ideas. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to see another really interesting Caro Kann game, check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.